Hi everyone, this is Mike Zukowski. I oversee our Contrail product line, and welcome to the first webinar series of 2023, Contrail Administrator Basics. This is a part one, so we're going to cover a decent amount of the administrative side of Contrail, and then next month I believe we're scheduled for part two, where we'll dive a little more in depth in some of the more advanced features. First off, just a couple housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar. So you can view it later, and hopefully it'll make it up into our YouTube channel, so you can review anything that you missed later. Everyone should be on mute who's attending this. If you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and if you do so, either Rosemary or myself can unmute you, and you can ask the question. If you're not comfortable asking the question online, that's okay. There is the questions functionality as part of the webinar, so feel free to type in there, and we'll try and answer those questions as best we can, kind of in line with the training. So feel free to speak up or raise your hand while we're kind of walking through this. I'll also save a little bit of time at the end if you have any questions there. So we're going to get started. I'm going to talk a little bit about some basic administrative tasks, things like users and how do you set up the website, and then we'll dig more onto the data side as well. So again, if you've got any questions, feel free to type them up and we'll answer them the best you can. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Today I'm going to use our demonstration website to walk through this. As a note, if you aren't familiar, I do highly recommend the demonstration.onerain.com website for a couple of items. Things like dashboards is probably my number one thing I recommend here, because we do give examples for all the different dashboard widgets and things like that that you can leverage in your instance of Contrail. We'll have a training specifically on dashboards in another session, so we won't be covering it a lot today, but I do like to point that out because people do seem to like to use that as they're thinking about and creating specific views for what they're trying to look at. So as mentioned, today we're diving into the admin. And so the very first thing I need to do is log in. You can see I don't have our administrative link in here, so I am going to go ahead and log in. Okay, I'm going to use our onerain.demonstration account. Hopefully I got my password right. And I did. And so one of the first things I wanted to highlight here was for the advanced users, I did not directly log in. I have what's called one-time password, and sometimes you'll hear two-factor authentication configured for my account. And this is something that's available to everyone, which I will review today. It is something that we like to highlight as part of a secure process, and it does help limit access to the system. Specifically, if you've set up somebody with an account who may be within your organization but a different group, or maybe someone who's outside of your organization, and if they do leave that organization, in lieu of having to immediately cut them off their access through our means, if they don't have access to, say, their email anymore, they won't be able to get this activation email for verification, and then they won't be able to access the system. So something that I do like to recommend for most people, probably something you're familiar with a lot of the other websites these days as well. So I've logged in successfully now, and you can see I do have the administration link available to me. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. So the very first thing that I want to do is kind of go through user creation and edit, kind of highlight a few new things in there. And it is one of the primary things that you'll do as a system administrator when you're first setting up a system. So as you can see, I'm in administration, which looks a little bit different. Navigation bar is going to be on my left instead of the top. Some of the logos and colors are different, really just to kind of highlight that you're in a different environment from the kind of standard user or data environment. So a couple ways to get there, which is common with our UI. We've got our tiles up top here where I can click users, but it's also available to me under configuration. I'll see users here as well. So pretty much anything that is quickly can be accessed can also be accessed through the side panel. But I'm going to go ahead and just use my tile here. Both links take me to the same page. And click to users. So again, another common paradigm that we've introduced is the counts and then these buttons up here are filters as well. You can see we don't have any disabled users, but if we did, I could quickly access that link by just clicking this tile at the top, and then that will filter my list to only disabled users. In this case, we don't have any, and I want to add one anyway, so I'm just going to go directly to add, and we'll just create a fake user. So I'm just going to name it training user, and then give it an email. So I'm going to put in my email. And as you notice there, as I moved off of that email tile, it did fill in the username. With the email, we do recommend to keep those consistent. However, they do not need to be. The one thing that's probably most important on this page, though, is making sure that the email for the user you're creating is correct. Because if they forget their password, things like that, it ties into that email. And that's kind of the mechanism that we can use to reach out to those people with those links and passwords and reports and all of that kind of thing. So that's probably the most important thing on this page. But I do want to walk through some of the other panels. So the next one here, date time. So this is what the user will see when they log in for time zones. So this covers things such as data. So as we collect data into Contrail, we always store it in UTC because we collect data from lots of different time zones, lots of different protocols. We convert all of that into UTC to store it in the database. But as our users are spread out through different parts of the country or internationally as well, they want to obviously view the data in their local time zone. So we do offer every time zone that is available. As you can see here, you can click through it and find it. The format of the date time, you can pick and choose that as well. I personally prefer the default which is an ISO 8601 format. It really makes it a lot easier to sort and filter through data, especially if you download it and are using it in other tools. And then of course, the format for date time. Again, I kind of like this format, which would be the 24-hour format, but we do offer things like AM and PM and things like that. And again, these are user-based, so they're not server-wide. It's really for the user who is logged in. Then some other standard panels that you're familiar with, which would be which base map when they go into the map will be visible, and then which view they're associated with. And we'll cover views in a minute here as well. Okay, so a couple things that have changed from the last time that we kind of did this training as well. The first one is we don't collect a few of the items such as phone numbers and things like that anymore. They were really just reference points in the software, and to eliminate and be more compliant with GDPR and other privacy acts and things like that, we've started to strip away any of that information that is not useful or is not used, so that has gone away. The next one is password. So before I get into this one, I just want to highlight that we do have information down here about what is required for the password. Whoops, didn't mean to copy that. That's okay. So this is all configurable by a high-level system administrator at the client level. I'm probably not going to cover that today because it is a little bit of an advanced feature, but if your IT department does have requirements that you need to meet for third-party software, such as, it has to be 12 characters long, or you have to include special characters or numbers, or if the password has to expire after a certain amount of time, all of that is available and configurable in Contrail. And this is just kind of highlighting what those are if you are creating a password. One thing that we've also added is an automated password generator, which I'm going to click here. So this creates a password that does follow these parameters below, and that way I can send it off and not know what it is, and it's randomly generated, etc. So again, just something I like to use if I'm setting up a brand new user, which I'm going to do here. So a couple of other options that have been added since the last time that we've provided this overview. The first one is verify. So this is that one-time password, or the two-factor authentication, if you will, that you saw when I actually logged in. So if I were to turn this on, that would mean when the user logs in, not only do they have to enter their username and password, once they do that, we will send them a code to their email, and they'll have to put that code, that 6-digit code, in to verify their account. So I do recommend that, and I recommend that you turn it on for people. The next one is this email password. So what this will do, if I turn it on, is when I create this user, it will actually email them information about their username It will send them their password. It will give them the links they need to get into and access their instance of Contrail. So that's kind of the summary right now for configuring and setting up a user. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit save, and I'll end up deleting this guy out later. So the next page after you do create a user is the privileges page. As you can see, if I scroll down, nothing is selected currently, which means that this user, they could log in and they can view data on the user side, but they have very limited access to things on both the user side, and they can't access any components of the administration side as well. So I'm just going to kind of walk through these, and what I typically tell people is from top to bottom, these are close to how much power and how scary it is to give it to them, if you will. So the higher level privileges they can do, the more damage they can do to the system, but it also grants them access to different modules that they'll use to configure and set up the system. So I just want to highlight, you should be careful, especially around creating users and creating systems. And one reason that users is high is that if you can create a user and you have access to the users module, you can change your privileges and other people's privileges. Based on the account in the client that I'm logged in at currently, we're not seeing one additional privilege, which you'll see, most people will see in their Contrail instance, which is called settings. And settings is the highest privilege, and that actually gives you access to modules to monitor and configure things down at a server level, which would allow you to reboot the server, look at processing power, etc. But for this account, if they're just a standard user, typically what I would do, I would set them up with something perhaps like view alarms and maybe reports. And what that would do is it would allow them to view alarms, but they couldn't create alarms, and they can run reports as well. So they would have some minimal administrator access to go ahead and get reports. But kind of from top to bottom here, users is what I'm accessing now, this module. Systems allows you to access and configure the data collection and set things like calibrations. Delete sites, obviously, allows you to delete sites and sensors. I really recommend that you turn this one off if you're setting up a user, just to eliminate any chance that they would delete something that they shouldn't. And if they do need to, then you have to jump through a number of extra steps to enable it and have them log out and log back in before they can do it. Again, just kind of a security thing to make sure no one's deleting anything. And then the other ones, change data. Obviously, you can get in, delete, add, edit data. Privilege is probably the next biggest one to talk about in terms of functionality. As we'll see as we step through the UI, there are a number of toggles that have published and privileged next to them. And what this access level allows you to do is limit or expose certain things on the user side. And when we walk through example, maybe I'll show like a battery. Maybe you don't want some users to see that, but you want your maintenance personnel to see that one. So you can wrap things in that privileged setting here to kind of limit and segregate in terms of who should be able to see some of that deeper dive stuff than other ones. Just to highlight the last few, alarms allows you to actually create and edit alarms. And then there's some viewing of invalid data and raw data, et cetera, after that. So as you can see at the bottom, I've just got a continue button. So I'm just gonna click one of these buttons here so you can see it, because this is something that comes up pretty regularly. When you're changing things on the administration side, there's kind of two functions. One is buttons like these toggles or radio buttons, where if you click them, you'll see we get add privilege. We kind of get that notification in the top right there. What that indicates is that the change was made. Once I click that, if I see that notification, the change is instantaneous. Other aspects of the pages we'll see, we'll have a save button at the bottom, which is a form submit, which means as you make changes, nothing happens in the database until you hit that save button. So just something to highlight because it's kind of a mixed paradigm within the infrastructure. Okay, so I'm just gonna hit continue, and then I've got my new user here, which is my training user at the bottom. If I wanna edit it, I can just click on it. I can edit and change all of that same stuff that we saw before. In in the action menu, I can change my privileges and I can also change the password. What I like to do if somebody has forgotten their password, first of all, I usually tell them to click the forgot password button on the login page and hopefully they have their username. But if that's not working for them, there is a reset button up top where if I click it, I can send them a new email that'll have a time sensitive link that they can click it and change their password there. Okay, so I think that's about it for users. We can access logs and things like that from here as well. If we have time, we'll show that a little bit later today. Okay, so the next component that I wanted to go to is configuration web. And what this is the look and feel of your overall instance of Contrail. So as you can see, we've got a logo and a secondary logo here. And this applies not to the admin side, but rather to the user side. So I'm actually going to open another tab here. By clicking this home button, I'm going to hold Control down so I get another tab. And even though we're using the same logo between both environments, the logo that I'm going to look at here actually is these ones on the home side. And what it is the logo, you can see the cloud and a secondary logo, which is Contrail here. And what this is related to is when we're on a phone or something smaller, as you can see, that secondary logo will start to go away due to the mobile responsiveness and to save some space on the screen. We do recommend certain sizes here for in terms of resolution and also for display purposes, kind of gives you the best view of it if you stick to those sizes. And they're easy to change. You just hit the edit button. And if you have a file, let's say on your desktop or something like that, you would just click the browse button on the right, and then you would be able to select that. If it's a web-based file, you can use this toggle and then you can put in a URL. So this one is actually using a local web file, which is on the server itself. So I have a local link. So you can see here, I don't have like HTTPS demonstration.onerain.com. So this means it's a relative link, which it'll stay on the server. And then of course you can put the alternative text and things like that for screen readers as well. So fairly easy to change. Secondary logo, Contrail, I showed that. The last one to show on this particular page would just be the backgrounds. Again, you can use a picture if you want, and lots of people do. You just upload the file here, or you can have it stored locally, or you can use it by color. So I'm just gonna maybe pick the blue color here and hit save, just to show you guys what it looks like. There you go, I changed that top banner here. Okay, so for the next piece of the web design, I want to go to pages on the right. So pages is how we change the look and feel and the content of what is actually on the user side. So you can see here I've got two defined, home and sensor. So let's look at home first. So as you can see here, it kind of looks like our dashboard configuration now. So this is something that has changed. So before I go any further, I'm just going to click back on the user side here. When we're doing administration around the web, there's a number of things we can change, specifically on the home page. We can change the color, we can change the logos, and pretty much everything below this home breadcrumb here, everything that's in this white panel, this is all configurable by you as a system administrator. So you can't really change the navigation components, but this bottom part is available for you to change. So one thing that is different since the last time we presented this is on the configuration for pages is we can now drop widgets in. So it used to just be basically one single HTML bucket, which you can see here. We still have the HTML, and if you click on it, you can still get that same WYSIWYG, and you can still use HTML and write in the source code if that's something you're willing and comfortable to do. But what you can also do is lay out your widgets so you can have different images, drop downs, things like that, etc. So you can see here we've kind of got some HTML words. We've got an image that we called Contrail image. We've got some other images and words below. So just kind of looking at this this widget setup here, it would relate to this component and then these pictures and then the HTML here with links. And then you can see we've got another image below it as well. So just kind of highlighting it because we get a few more options here than we used to. And again, all of these things can be wrapped in the published and privileged. So if you see this icon over here, it's the not published icon, and we could always go in and change that with the published and then privilege it how we see fit. So again, even on the home page now, you can provide additional links or access to users who need that kind of information, but limit access to, let's say, the public if you are publishing something to the public. So just to give you guys, it's going to leave there, just to give you guys a feel for like the additional widgets that you can use on the home page. It is limited compared to dashboards, but you are able to bring in the HTML, card images, links, buttons, drop downs, images. There's lots of different things you can do with these, which kind of help you create that website and help it get it formatted, especially if you're not overly comfortable writing HTML. So I'm going to go back up in my breadcrumb to my list of pages. And one that may have caught your eye is this sensor one here. There is an add button for these pages, and I'm going to click it. And you can see we kind of give you the list of the different buttons or different pages that are available for you to put additional context and additional information in, and that's what this is for. So let's take a look at the sensor one. So what this relates to is actually the sensor page. So you can see here the /sensor. What does this mean? Well, I'm going to go back to my user side. I apologize for kind of jumping back and forth, but kind of the easiest way to show it. I'm just going to go ahead and navigate to a sensor. Just pick one here. Okay, so we're on a sensor page or on a site page, so I need to actually go down one more to the sensor. What you can see here is we've actually written a disclaimer. So this is probably the most popular one for at least the sensor page, where data should be considered provisional, any kind of other information that you kind of want to use to give that broad brushstroke here. You can see there's a panel here, and if I go to page, I'm actually going to go ahead and from the top level, I'm just going to unpublish that. And if I refresh my page, you can see that notification went away. So I'm going to add it back in. But what this does is gives you the ability, so I just turned it back on. You can see it'll show back up here. Gives you the ability to provide additional context about your system. Again, provisional data is a popular way to go about it as well. So something that I like to highlight to people, they may not realize that they have the ability to kind of change some of the information, some of the layout on these pages. All right, kind of the last thing maybe on web, well, maybe two things. The first one is style sheets. So if you are comfortable with style sheets, you can drop your own in, and they do apply only on the user side. You can also do it at the page level as well, which is how we typically like to do it if we do want a certain look and feel about the links and things like that. So that is available to you. You can upload files and reference files directly in Contrail, and that's how you do that here. And then the last one would just be news. So if I click news, you can see there's 4 different news articles here. Some of them haven't been published, some of them are. And just to show you what that looks like is in the nav bar, if I have any news articles, I can click on news and see it. So we see the one there. The one thing I like to highlight, and really what I personally like to use when I'm administering one of these Contrail systems, if you hit edit or when you're creating it, you'll have this option to pin the article as well. So I'm just going to hit yes. So on my news page, it doesn't really change anything, but if I were to go back to home, you'll see we'll get a blue box here with the information and the same information from that news article. This is really great if you're trying to give people information about sites or sensors that are down, if you're doing maintenance work, or if there's any expectation, that your network is gonna have issues. It's a great way to communicate, kind of catches the eye for people who are first coming in. I'm gonna go ahead and unpin that one. Okay, I think that kind of wraps up the web for this one. So the next thing I want to move on to, unless there's any questions, is systems. So systems are one of the primary kind of frameworks for data in Contrail. So to just kind of go through our vernacular, systems are how we bring data into Contrail or push data out or make it available to someone else on the output side. Every site that gets defined in Contrail. So your gauging locations, whether they're true gauging locations that you maintain, third party, maybe it's derived data, they'll all be owned or part of a system. And then each sensor is defined as part of a site. So every sensor is part of a site and every site is part of a system. So just some of the vernacular that we use. So I'm going to switch over just based on who I'm logged in here as, and just kind of show you and talk a little bit about systems here. So I'm in administration. I'm actually logged in as a different level of user here. So I'm going to go to systems and add. So by adding a system, this is how we bring data in. Like I said, that would be an input system. If we wanted data to be available, whether that's through an API or we're sending chef data to the National Weather Service, those would be output systems. So let's talk about input systems first. So input systems, you can see here, we select input, we have types. There is numerous types of ways to bring data into Contrail. We group them 3 different ways. The first one we call data agents. This is typically data that is hosted by a third party or is brought in through a file that we're scraping or something like that, or an API endpoint. So you can see here, in addition to FTS and Lambricht and Earth Networks and the other AEM companies, we also bring in data from other third-party sources. So ADS Prism, also USGS and other government-related ones. So there's a number of these in here. So this list continues to expand. So if you do have data that you would be interested in aggregating into Contrail, I highly recommend you kind of look through these systems to see if it's there, or maybe talk to us about it. The only one I want to highlight in agent that some people don't know about is this universal agent. And we're not going to set one up today, but it allows you to bring a file in, whether that file gets pushed to the server locally through SFTP, or if it's a file that lives out on a web. But you can write a regular expression. So assuming that the file is set up in a somewhat close of a format, we can typically bring that data in. So it's a really flexible way to bring data into Contrail. So the other 2 groups that we have, the first one, or second one, I guess, would be the API. So data exchange input, this would be an API listener where you or maybe one of your third parties has an automated program that posts data into Contrail. Data bridge is how we bring in data across separate instances of Contrail, and then of course our camera vision data, some radar data, stuff like that. And then the last one is data collectors, and this is when data is pushed to Contrail. So things like Alert and Alert 2, if you're familiar with some other third parties like Sutron or IntelliSense, things like that. Those are listeners that we set up, the gauges or the endpoint makes a connection to Contrail and pushes data across in a specific format. So that is all available. On the output side, just to highlight a few things here, through the API, there's a number of different items. Data exchange is kind of our standard API mechanism. If you're using some of our other AEM family brands software, FTS 360 or some View software, we've got special output agents for them to make it really efficient for doing data transfer. There's event data, which if you're not familiar with this, this is a really nice tool where you can send comma delimited data that you kind of put together. You decide what you want in it and what information you want to share, whether that's timestamps, information about the site, information about the sensor. For example, if you're running some dam operations, you can have reservoir elevations in your inbox every morning when you get to work. It's used for that kind of information. And then, of course, our standard Chef A and Chef E for transportation to the National Weather Service. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to a system that's already built. Yeah, and we'll cover some of the outputs and the inputs in a future webinar where we get in deep and kind of talk about how the universal agent works and how we set up systems for availability on the API. So I'm going to go back to systems really quick to get a list because we can see there's a number of them that are already defined. I'm actually going to switch over to my other login because it's a little bit cleaner in terms of the number of systems and things like that. And I'm just going to use the USGS demonstration as an example because pretty much everybody on this call at least, would have access to some USGS sites and sensors that they may be interested in bringing in. So I'm just going to click it. So a couple things to highlight here. We can see there's 30 sites that have been defined as part of this system and 88 sensors. And these are clickable tiles, which will filter the list down to those 30 sites. So I'll click it in a second because there's something I want to show you there. But just some general information, things like the key. So this is what we would call a system key, and also the system ID or database ID is here. I only highlight those because when we start talking about alarms in a future webinar, if you're setting up things, it is possible to set up system-wide alarms where you can know if your entire USGS or your entire Alert 2 network is no longer sending you data. And these keys and database IDs are important for when you're configuring those alarms and rules. Next section is tags, which we'll probably cover in another webinar, but it does allow you to track metadata across pretty much everything in Contrail, and it's freeform, so you can track what you need to track, which matches your operations. And then some attributes about how often it runs, which server it runs on. So a couple things here, maybe for USGS you wouldn't change it, but if you are having a file pushed to you, you may want to offset by a few minutes the recurrence for when that universal agent picks up or the LoggerNet agent picks up or something like that, so that you can time and reduce latency. And then for those of you who have multi-server configurations or hybrid configurations, you can actually choose which server it runs on. So if it traditionally runs on your on one of your machines and you're having firewall issues or something like that with your internal network, you can actually go in and change it so that it would run, say, from our cloud instead. So it's just a handy way to do some failover and things like that if you're not aware of it. A couple other things on here, sensor types. So sensor types, you can think of them as templates. So as you're setting up a new site, when you're configuring it, you select what kind of template it is. And there's 750 or more of these different templates that you can set up. The part of the reason that we like to do it that way is one, when you're creating lots of sites and sensors or doing imports, it makes it really easy to standardize all of that kind of information. The other reason is that you can make bulk changes to that. So for 1 hour accumulation, let's say I wanted to spell out hour for some reason. If I hit edit, I can actually add in those additional letters there and hit save. And then hit the update button on the right here. And if I select parameters and hit save, it would then update all of those sensors that are part of that type in the system in a bulk load. Really handy if you're dealing with a really large network. A couple other things in here. We do have things like thresholds where you can bulk change and update thresholds, different settings. This is more in line with if you have specific protocols like a Modbus protocol or something like that, where there's additional settings that are needed to bring the data in. That's where that kind of stuff lives. Then kind of the last one in this list would be for those of you who are doing rain accumulation resets. For USGS, it wouldn't matter, but if you had a type of system that counts up like an Alert 2 network, in lieu of going to every single rain accumulation sensor, you will see when you go to that site, you will see a rain reset button here, and you can initiate those rain resets from one click of the button. So kind of the next aspect I want to cover here is on sites and USGS. As I mentioned, a lot of you guys probably have access to USGS sites that are close to you. So I kind of wanted to show you how an easy way that you can go about bringing in some of those USGS sites if you're interested in doing that. And this actually applies to a number of the different systems that we have available. If there's a geographic component to it with the API, we can usually do some, what we call, it's the find mechanism. So we can find the sites and sensors that are available. So I'm just gonna click that. And what this does is we'll go out, we're gonna define a geographic fence here, and we'll go out when we hit save, and the system will go find if there's any sensors or sites, in this case, available. So I'm just gonna go ahead and type in that, I think it was 39. I'm just gonna follow this and hope we get some information back. Close enough. And then I just hit save. And what this is doing is it goes out and queries the USGS, in this case, their API, for any sites that might be available. So you can kind of see the raw data here of what's available. But then if I go down a little bit further, you'll actually see some import information here as well. And what this gives you is everything you need to actually bring and define these sites in Contrail. We'll do sensors in a second, but you can see we've got the site name, we've got our site ID, I'm sorry, the name, the lat, long, and elevation. So all that information is here for you, so you can just copy and paste it over, or you can copy it into, let's say, a CSV or a tab delimited file and bulk import it into Contrail that way. And the same is also true for sensors. I'm just gonna run that again. It'll go out and query and bring back a list of sensors that are available, again, in this geographic area. So you can see this one's kind of taking a little bit longer because it's probably going to be pulling back a lot more data. But depending on, well, in this case, it wasn't that much, but kind of want to keep this geographic area not too huge because it can time out the APIs and things like that. But again, this gives us everything we need to create a sensor, whether that's through manual creation or whether it's through bulk creation, right here. So I can just copy and paste this again into a tab delimited file, and then upload that file and it'll create the sensor. So we've got our site ID, sensor IDs, sensor types, names, class, all the information we need to do some bulk loading here. Okay, so with that said, let's actually go ahead and take a look at a site. I'm gonna use the USGS again. And just kind of pick one here. So Boulder Creek near Longmont, Colorado. So this is pretty close to our office actually. You can see we've got 3 sensors defined here. Here's a good use of an example of tags. So this is a site level tag that's been defined as data provider USGS. And I bet if I went and found like a METAR airport site or something like that, we would have data provider METAR. And this allows us to quickly filter and export these kind of lists for reporting reasons and things like that. So kind of the only thing to highlight on a site, I think, for this session would just be in service and the published and privileged. Of course, you can always change the names of sites and things like that. But in service, if you're not familiar with this will, in the case of a data agent that's going out and getting data, if I turn this to off, this will no longer go try and attempt to get data for it. If it's a collector, meaning data is being pushed to us, it'll actually mark the data that's pushed to us with a special maintenance mode flag so that you know there's either something wrong with the site or something like that. It's been put out of service. And then it won't show up in graphs, at least those data points won't. Those data points don't get evaluated for alarming purposes. So there's a number of things that it's useful for. So if you are going out and cleaning your tipping buckets or recalibrating a water level pressure transducer, let's say, you can set your site and sensor to out of service, and that way that data, if you're a higher level privileged user, you can see the data in the tables. There are ways to view it in the graph, but it won't show up for, let's say, your public users. So I highly recommend that. The next one we kind of talked about a little bit, but published and privileged. If I click published to no, then this site is really only going to be available in administration. I'll have to go find it there. If it's published, that means it will show up on the user side. So if it's published and not privileged, then everyone can see it on the user side. If it's privileged, then only people who have that that attribute or that setting for their user account enabled will be able to see it. So I'm just going to cancel so I don't change anything here. And then we'll just kind of dive into, let's say, the stage sensor here. Just want to highlight a few items on here. Again, we can do our tags. So if you're not someone who uses, let's say, like our inventory program, tags would be a good thing for sensors around, this is a bubbler or this is a radar sensor, kind of for something like stage, it's nice to know what kind of equipment is out there, at least the general type of device it is. Let's look down at data first. Of course, we have our date picker. I want to highlight a few items here since this is the basics training. The first one is with every data point, we store a number of things. The first one that I'm trying to highlight there is the data timestamp. So this is, again, a USGS gauge. So this is when the reading was taken. If the protocol supports it, this is the timestamp that's included with the data when it comes out of the transmitter. However, we also keep a second time, which we call receive time, and you can see 10 minutes ago, 25 minutes ago, etc. as we look down here. If we highlight it, we can see there's a different timestamp, so 13:31:07 versus 13:15. So you can see in that case, the latency is 16 minutes. What that means is the data was taken and recorded locally at the gauge at 13:15, but we didn't actually see that data in Contrail, so it wasn't available for things like alerting or visualization until 16 minutes later. And you can kind of see here, there's a pattern. This one's 1 hour, 46, 31, 16. What this indicates is, and it's a USGS site, so this is common, they actually take the recordings, but they only send the data once an hour. So you can kind of see the latency here. The other protocol that this is really valuable for is Alert 2 networks. So you can kind of verify some of your TDMA configurations. You can kind of verify some of the GPS drift, etc., by using those latency tools. So a couple other things that we store at each data report as well. First one on the right is the engineering or finished value. So in this case, it's 9.64 feet. We always also keep a raw data value. So in this case, they happen to be the same. So what we actually heard in the protocol and what we actually decoded is 9.64. And in this case, there's no conversion. It's the same as the source. So we propagate the finished with that. That's not true in most protocols. And a lot of times we'll have offsets and things like that. But we always keep both numbers. One is so you can go back and look at that for maintenance reasons. The second one is we have the ability to do something called revalidation. And what that does is if we click revalidation, we can select a time period, start and an end. And if I hit save, it will then take that raw data that we received, reprocess it with the current calibration, and update the numbers. So the revalidation is really important for things like, if you're out there and for some reason on your rain tipping bucket, you forgot to mark it as maintenance mode. And when you were taking it off to clean it, you accidentally dropped it and it rolled down the hill and tipped, 50 times or something like that. You can go back and reprocess that data using the revalidation tools. Another classic example would be if you calibrated a stage gauge and then you forgot to update it in Contrail, although you made some changes locally, or maybe you replaced the equipment, you can use these revalidation tools to reprocess that data from that point forward. A couple other things to highlight on that is we do store and run every point through a validation process. So in this case, this is good data. You'll see it marked with other letters, and if you hover over them, it'll give you the information about what it means. It's also available online at help. You can download the data directly from here. A couple other things to highlight around data. First one would be edit. So we do give you the ability to edit data. Not something we typically like to do, but you can go in and change it, and then you just have to hit the check mark to change it. This is good for changing 1 or 2 or a couple of data points. Revalidation is usually better for changing lots of data points. You can change the raw. The one thing that gets used regularly, at least I do sometimes when I'm cleaning up data, is you can actually manually set these codes. So these are those validation codes. That's something that that I use if I'm trying to, take some rain gauge data or some data that had an issue due to maintenance or whatever it was. It makes some changes that way. The other one that you can do here that I like to highlight is this annotation. So I'm going to go ahead and create an annotation on this data point. So I can put a title in, and let's say we're out there doing maintenance or something like that. Maintenance, it automatically filled in the time for me. And then I can put a comment here. maintenance common, and maybe I'd put something like changed out the PT. So there we go. So I've got it. So let's go back to the stage gauge. And what we can see here is we've got an extra flag because it's right on that data point. We also have it down here. If you hover and click, you get information about it. Maintenance changed out the PT. If it's longer, it'll cut it off and you can actually click on it. The other thing, it does show up on the user side as well, which is really handy. So I'm gonna go ahead again, just kind of open a new tab so I can make it back here easily. Just go to that sensor. And what you can see is I have my annotation here, but what's nice is it does show up on the graph as well, and you can click on it here. So it's a good way to track and just put some data information on about like peak flows would be popular, start of an event, end of an event. You know, if a stage goes up and there wasn't rain because you cleaned out a culvert or something like that, you can put those annotations there. So when other people are looking at it, or when you go back in a few years and you can't remember why something happened, just a good way to give that reference point and some information around it. So I'm just gonna go ahead and delete that one so we don't have it around anymore. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to my site and my sensor. Just to highlight a few things, again, just because we're in kind of this basic training. In the edit menu for sensors, or when you're adding it, you'll kind of have the same fields. Again, we have our options on the right. Name and description are available. Just for those who are unaware, both of these don't matter in terms of data processing. You can make them whatever you want, whatever's helpful for you. But sensor IDs and site IDs almost always do. So we don't recommend changing that unless you know what you're doing. You can always set your units, etc. Interval is the best guess on how often data comes in. This gets used in some advanced reports and things like that, and is set up for future information, but it doesn't actually impact how sensor data flows. Kind of the two things though that I really wanted to highlight on this page. First one is date time. As I mentioned earlier, we store everything in UTC because we do get information and data from lots of different time zones, and that's kind of hard to keep track of. This is different than the time zone that is attached to the user. This is actually used to say when data comes in from this sensor, it's in mountain time. So this helps us convert it into UTC. So it's important just to make sure these are consistent with what the data is. And then the last one on this page is calibration. So you can see here direct, meaning we just take it and put it directly in. The finished value matches exactly the raw. But as you can see, we offer a lot of different ones. Probably the most popular would be linear, applying a slope and an offset. Increments and ink ups and inks down are good for tipping buckets or anything that's doing counting. Of course, you can create equations if you're trying to calculate derived information from lots of different other sensors, whether you're, adding up different flows or calculating evapotranspiration, let's say, lots of different things you can do there. We also offer rating table lookups for things like flow, if you have a rating table and it's derived from the water level. And then time series, you can create time series off of sparse data in real time, et cetera, with that. Just something we'd cover in another session. Okay, so one last thing to show on the sensor page, if you're not familiar with it, would be thresholds. And these are visual context, if you will, about a data. And they can also be used on the map, and they can also be used for alarming purposes. So I'm just going to create one. So you can see here, 9.64 is our latest reading. So I'm just going to use something in that area. I'm just going to create one and just say, flood stage, something like that. So we do have some helpers. So if you do have, if you are creating a lot of these, we do recommend you try and be consistent as possible, which is why we have this. So let's just call it flood stage there, National Weather Service flood stage. And I'm just going to put a value of 9.5 on it, just something a little bit below. Shared, published, and privileged. So if you're in a multi-tenant system and you're sharing your data across, that's what that shared is for. This will actually allow those other clients to view the threshold. Published and privileged, same as always. Display, graph, and map. So with the graph, this will mean whether it's automatically on or off when you bring up a page that has the graph on it. So this is important for something like if you do track something like a record high for a stage gauge or something like that, you might not want to have that on the graph all the time because it kind of changes the resolution that's available. So you may want to turn that off. I'm going to leave it on for now. And then map is whether the threshold is used on the map or not, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then of course the color, you just pick the color that relates to what you're interested in here. And again, the biggest thing I recommend is consistency. If you're using flood stage across multiple stage sensors, I highly recommend you use the same color for them and same for other ones. So let's just hit save. Okay, so we can see it there now. And if we were to go and graph this sensor, we can see that visual threshold is available now as well. And then additionally on the map, if I have thresholds turned on, so that was a stage gauge. And I don't know if so out of the box, I don't have thresholds configured to be on, but they can be. So I'm just gonna turn it on. And you can see here that 9.64, which is down near our office there. So it's now giving us that quick indicator that we are at flood stage. So if I look on my right on my legend, I do see flood stage and I do see that orange. So this legend is part of the reason we like to keep this consistent. If you have lots of different colors and lots of different names, the legend becomes too big to actually be able to monitor what's actually going on there. Okay, so I'm gonna go back. Go ahead and just delete that out so no one gets confused if they're looking at this data. And then kind of the last one component I want to talk about a little bit is views. And we'll cover in next month's session, we'll get to the alerting components in that module, as well as some of the other reports and logs. But for now, let's just click on views. And the reason I want to talk about views is this is one, again, it's another part of the framework that is really important as you're designing and configuring your Contrail instance, specifically because views are how we group things together and how on the user side things get used and how like your end users are actually going to look at things. And so there's a number of different ways to configure and set this up. You can actually do it from the system level, but this is personally how I like to do it. The other ways are when you actually add a new site, you get to pick which views are in it. So I'm just going to kind of walk through. We're going to create a view so you guys can kind of see what that looks like. So first of all, you see we already have 18 views created. So that's actually a decent amount. And these are kind of common views. So the very first one, and most of you will have something that's named all sites, or maybe it's called default view or something like that. The only thing I want to highlight about that is, even though it's called all sites, that's just the name someone gave it. It doesn't actually include all the sites unless it was configured to be so. It's not like a magic one or anything like that. But then the other thing you can see here is there's a couple of other views called location, and then with a specific name. So California, Chicago, Colorado. Again, very common. If you're a smaller agency, this may be based on your basin or a sub-basin or something similar to that. And then the other most common one is what has already been defined in here as well, which is the source, which is what data feed is this brought from. You don't have to create these views. You can just leave one and just keep adding to it. But if you do have users who are responsible for, say, different regions or different areas or maybe different watersheds, or you're really interested in making sure your Alert 2 data is viewed separately from the USGS so people don't get confused about the real-time data, et cetera, these are great ways to do it. So I'm just going to show you how we do it in terms of like just adding one, go through some of the mechanics. So I'm just going to add a new view, and I'm just going to call it training maybe. Again, published and privileged, so you can limit access here. And the only reason I'll say that this is important here for the privileged is because you can, if you've got certain sites that you just want privileged people to see and not regular users, in lieu of doing the privilege at the site level, you can actually do it at the view level because only people with that access level would actually be able to see them. So I'm gonna hit save. So it created basically a generic blank view. So in order to actually leverage this and add sites to it, I do need to hit the add button, and then I can go through and just add my views. So again, as I click these, we can see we get information here that it did add them. And if I were to go down, we would just see the continue button. So this means that even though I didn't hit save, I've got 3 in there. So I can go to my training view, and there we go, I've got 3. So another nice thing for like these longer lists are these filters. So if I do have a long list and I want to take something out, I can just click the enable and I'll only get my 3 there as well. So with that, since we're kind of running up against the time frame here, I'm going to go ahead and pause. As I mentioned, we'll do some additional highlights specifically around the alarms module, the reporting modules, and the logs module in next month's webinar. So with that, I'm going to kind of stop. I am going to stay on for a few minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat or the questions box, and or feel free to raise your hand. We can unmute you, and we'll try to answer those the best we can. So again, thank you. Appreciate everybody joining us today, and hope to hear from you soon.